The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Every eye in the room was locked onto the small figure standing at the front. She barely reached the podium, her fingers trembling as they clutched the single sheet of paper that could change everything. Emily Walker, just 12 years old, stood before the judge, before the jury, before the sea of strangers who had already made up their minds about her father. Fear clawed at her insides, but she refused to let it show. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin, forcing herself to meet the judge's piercing gaze. In her tiny hands, she held the truth. Truth no one wanted to believe, the truth no one had bothered to look for. Her voice wavered, but when she spoke, it was loud enough to cut through the heavy air. "Your Honor, this proves my father is innocent." A ripple moved through the courtroom, murmurs rising like a slow-moving wave. The prosecutor, Mr. Fields, stiffened in his chair, his fingers curling into fists. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark pools of skepticism. Emily could feel her heartbeat slamming against her ribs, a steady drum of panic, but she held her ground. She had to. She had spent weeks putting the pieces together, going through old records, following threads no one else had noticed. And now, standing in front of the people who held her father's future in their hands, she was terrified that none of it would be enough. The judge studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was measured, but there was something behind it, something Emily couldn't quite place. "What is this, young lady?" She took a shaky breath, tightening her grip on the paper as if holding on to it could keep her from falling apart. "It's proof," she said, her voice steady this time. "Proof that my father didn't commit that robbery. Proof that someone else did." A sharp silence followed. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging glances with the detective sitting beside him. The air in the room felt different now, thick with something unspoken, something shifting. But doubt still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily saw it in the judge's gaze, in the way the jury members whispered among themselves. She had presented the truth, but was it enough? Would they listen? Or had they already made up their minds? The judge finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, his fingers steepled together in thought. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, the courtroom doors swung open with a forceful bang. Every head turned, every breath caught. And just like that, everything changed. 2 months ago, Emily's world had shattered in an instant. One moment, she was sitting at the dinner table with her father, laughing about how terrible his cooking was. The next, their front door was being kicked open, red and blue lights flashing outside, officers storming in with cold, emotionless expressions. Thomas Walker had barely gotten a word out before they grabbed him. "You're under arrest for armed robbery," they had said, their voices mechanical, rehearsed, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Emily had watched in horror as they shoved his hands behind his back, snapping metal cuffs around his wrists. Her father, the man who had spent his whole life teaching her right from wrong, who had never raised his voice in anger, who still packed her lunch every morning, was now being dragged out, like a criminal. The trial had moved fast. Too fast. The evidence against Thomas seemed airtight. Security footage placed him near the scene. A witness, a man whose face Emily could barely remember, claimed he saw Thomas running from the store. The money was never found, but none of that mattered. The police had him, and in their eyes, that was enough. But Emily knew better. She had sat in that cold, unfeeling courtroom, listening as they painted her father as a desperate man, a liar, a thief. And every second, she had wanted to scream, because they were wrong. Her father wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a criminal. And deep down, she knew that something about this case didn't add up. She spent weeks replaying the details over and over, unable to let it go. If no one else was going to prove her father's innocence, then she would. She started with the footage. The grainy black and white clip showed a man outside the store, a figure the prosecution swore was Thomas. But something felt off. The way he walked, the way he carried himself, it wasn't right. Emily pored over old records, searched through documents no one else had bothered to look at. And then, buried in the mess of legal papers and reports, she found it. A single document. A mistake. A timestamp that shouldn't have existed. Her hands shook as she held the paper, realization dawning on her. The witness who swore he saw her father? His statement had been recorded before the robbery even happened. It was a lie. The evidence wasn't just weak. It was planted. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the page in her hands. If she was right, this wasn't just about her father anymore. Someone wanted him to take the fall, and she was going to find out why. The courtroom felt colder now. Emily stood frozen at the podium, gripping the document like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The judge's stare bore into her, sharp and unreadable. His fingers tapped against the wooden bench, slow and deliberate. "Miss Walker," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "do you have any idea what it means to present evidence in a court of law?" Emily swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure." The judge arched a brow, his skepticism evident. "This document. Where did you get it?" Her fingers tightened around the paper. "I found it while going through case files. It proves my father couldn't have committed that robbery. The timeline doesn't match." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, hushed whispers between jurors, attorneys shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Across the room, Mr. Fields, the prosecutor, sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched. Emily caught the slight twitch in his fingers as he reached for his pen, tapping it against the desk. A nervous habit, maybe. The judge exhaled slowly, then turned his piercing gaze toward Fields. "Mr. Fields, I assume you've reviewed this document?" Fields hesitated. It was barely a second, but Emily saw it. The flicker of doubt. The way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. He started, but the hesitation was all it took. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Bring it here." Fields forced a nod and stood, straightening his tie as he walked over. He took the paper from Emily's hands, but he didn't read it right away. Instead, he stared at it, his grip a little too tight. Emily watched him, every second dragging like an eternity. Then, just as Fields opened his mouth to respond, the courtroom doors slammed open. Gasps echoed through the room as a police officer strode in, his face tense, his uniform crisp. He carried a folder, one hand gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Your Honor," the officer announced, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "We have new evidence that changes everything." The judge straightened, his expression unreadable. "Approach." The officer stepped forward, his boots heavy against the polished floor, and handed the folder to the judge. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what was in that file, but she knew one thing. Everything was about to change. The judge flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the pages with an expression that gave nothing away. The courtroom sat in breathless silence, every rustle of fabric, every shift in a seat amplified by the sheer weight of what was happening. Then, his brows furrowed. A small but noticeable reaction. Emily didn't dare move. Across the room, Mr. Fields had gone unnervingly still, his fingers gripping the edge of the prosecution table like he needed to steady himself. For the first time since the trial began, the confidence, the almost smug certainty he carried, was gone. The judge turned a page, then another, his jaw tensed. "Mr. Fields," he said, his voice sharp, "these documents, were they submitted by your office?" Fields opened his mouth, but no words came out. A second passed, then two, before he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. I'll need to review them, Your Honor. The judge's stare darkened. You'll have time for that, he said, closing the folder with a firm thud. Because until we verify this information, I am not proceeding with this trial. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Murmurs turned into low chatter, people leaning toward each other, whispering frantically. Emily barely heard them. She had done it. The trial was on pause. But then a thought crept in, cold and unwelcome. Where had this evidence come from? The officer had handed it over with such certainty, but who had found it? Who had waited until this moment to reveal it? The judge's voice cut through the noise. This court is in recess for 48 hours. We will reconvene once these documents have been authenticated. A gavel struck. The tension in the room broke. Chairs scraped against the floor. People rose to leave, but Emily remained frozen. Her father was safe, for now. But she knew better than to celebrate, because if this evidence was real, why hadn't it come forward earlier? And if it wasn't, then someone was playing a much bigger game. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind too restless to let sleep take over. The past few hours replayed over and over, the judge's decision, the prosecutor's unease, the sudden game-changing evidence. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, it left her with more questions than answers. Her father was still behind bars, and something about this case still felt wrong. Her phone buzzed beside her. She turned her head, frowning. It was nearly midnight. No one ever texted her this late. With a hesitant breath, she reached for the phone and flipped it over. The screen glowed in the darkness. Unknown number. Emily, you don't know me, but I know your father. I have information that can change everything. Meet me at the old library. Tonight. It's urgent. Her pulse spiked. She sat up, rereading the message, her fingers tightening around the phone. This had to be a trap, right? But what if it wasn't? She hesitated for only a moment before throwing off the covers and quietly slipping out of bed. The house was silent except for the faint creaks of the wooden floors beneath her feet. She tiptoed past her father's empty room, past the half-packed legal papers that sat untouched on the dining table. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped outside. The night air was sharp, cool against her skin. The streets were empty, bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights. She had never snuck out before, never walked alone this late. And yet, here she was. The old library was only a few blocks away. Once a grand building, it had long been abandoned, its walls lined with dust-covered books no one had touched in years. She reached the entrance, her breath hitching as she took in the massive, darkened windows, the towering stone pillars, the way the doors creaked when she pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten time. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floors. A sound. Footsteps. She tensed, her eyes darting toward the source, and then she saw him. A figure standing between the dusty bookshelves, half hidden in the dim glow of the moonlight. Her stomach twisted. Because the last person she expected to find waiting for her was the very man who had spent months trying to put her father behind bars. Mr. Fields. His face was unreadable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You came," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Emily took a step back, every instinct screaming at her to run. But something in his expression stopped her, because for the first time since she had met him, he didn't look like a prosecutor. He looked afraid. Emily's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Every part of her wanted to demand answers, to scream at Mr. Fields for everything he had done. But something about the way he stood there, tense and uneasy, made her hesitate. He wasn't here to fight. He was here because he had something to say. "Emily," he started, voice low, cautious, as if he wasn't sure how much to reveal. "You need to listen to me. Your father, he was never supposed to be the one on trial. Her stomach twisted. What does that mean? Fields exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. The evidence against him. It was planted. A chill ran down Emily's spine. She had always known something wasn't right, but hearing it come from the very man who had stood in court arguing against her father made it feel different. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He was admitting it. She took a slow step closer. Then why did you go along with it? His jaw tightened. Because I didn't have a choice. Emily narrowed her eyes. There's always a choice. Fields let out a humorless chuckle. Not in cases like this. He looked around, as if making sure they were alone before lowering his voice. The people behind this, they aren't just criminals, Emily. They're powerful. They have influence in places you wouldn't expect. Police, judges, politicians. This case, it was never about a robbery. Emily's breath caught. They needed your father out of the way, Fields continued. He knew something, or at least they thought he did. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. Knew what? Fields hesitated. There's a woman, Rachel Carter. She's involved in this case in ways you don't understand yet. She knows what really happened, and she might be the only person who can prove your father was framed. Emily's mind raced. Where is she? Fields pressed his lips into a thin line. That's the problem. She's gone underground. Either she's hiding, or someone made sure she wouldn't talk. Emily felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about proving her father's innocence anymore. It was about exposing something much darker. You have to find her, Fields said, his voice urgent. She's the key to everything. Emily met his gaze, determination burning in her chest. She had come this far. She wasn't about to stop now. Finding Rachel Carter was easier said than done. She wasn't listed in any directory, no social media presence, no trace of where she might be. It was as if she had vanished. But Emily refused to let that stop her. She retraced every step of the case, digging through old reports, searching for any connection Rachel had to the investigation. And then, finally, she found something. A rental address, buried deep in an old court document. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The building was on the edge of town, a run-down apartment complex with peeling paint and flickering streetlights. Emily hesitated outside the door, her pulse quickening. If Rachel really was hiding, there was a reason, and Emily was about to walk straight into it. She took a breath, then knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. A shuffling noise came from inside, followed by a slow creak of the door. A pair of wary eyes peeked through the crack. Rachel Carter. Her gaze darted around nervously before landing on Emily. Who are you? Emily took a step forward. I'm Emily Walker. My father is Thomas Walker. Rachel's face paled. I need to talk to you, Emily pressed. Mr. Fields told me you know the truth, that my father was framed. Rachel let out a sharp breath and shook her head. You shouldn't be here. Please, Emily pleaded. I just want to know what really happened. For a moment, Rachel hesitated, then finally, she unlocked the door and stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was small, dimly lit, and cluttered with stacks of papers and unopened envelopes. Rachel didn't offer Emily a seat. She just crossed her arms and gave her a tired look. You think this is just about your father? She said. Emily's stomach twisted. Rachel exhaled, running a hand through her disheveled hair. This goes deeper than one case, kid. The people who set up your father? They've been doing this for years, framing innocent people, shifting blame, covering up bigger crimes. It's not just one corrupt cop or a bad prosecutor. It's an entire network. Emily swallowed. Who are they? Rachel shook her head. I don't know all their names, but I know where you can start. She turned to a cluttered desk and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a folded map. She handed it to Emily. "There's a storage facility just outside the city," Rachel said. "Inside there are records, financial reports, case files, things they don't want anyone to see. If you want proof that your father was set up, that's where you'll find it." Emily unfolded the map, her fingers tracing the red-marked location. "But listen to me." Rachel's voice turned serious. "If they find out you're looking for this, they won't let you walk away." Emily tightened her grip on the paper. She had come too far to turn back now. The storage facility loomed ahead, silent and forgotten at the edge of town. The rusted gates hung open just enough for Emily to slip through, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had followed the map Rachel had given her, every step taking her closer to the truth. If these records were real, they would prove her father's innocence and expose the people who had framed him. The building's entrance was unlocked, but inside, it was eerily quiet. The air was thick with dust, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly above rows of towering filing cabinets. Emily moved carefully, scanning the labels on each one. Legal records, tax documents, case files. Then she saw it. A cabinet marked Project Blackout. Her fingers trembled as she yanked it open. Inside, neatly stacked folders bore names she recognized: judges, officers, business leaders. Each file contained transactions, forged reports, and the names of people who had been framed. And then, her father's name. Emily's breath hitched. She flipped through the pages, scanning dates, signatures, evidence that had been manipulated. This was it. The proof. A sound behind her. A slow shuffle of footsteps. She spun around just as a figure stepped out of the shadows. Jake Foster, the security officer who had helped her into the building, the one who had seemed hesitant but willing to assist. Emily took a step back. "What are you doing here?" Jake sighed, his expression unreadable. "I should be asking you that." Her grip tightened around the folder. "You knew." His jaw clenched. "I tried to keep you away from this, Emily. I told you to stop." Rage bubbled in her chest. "You were part of it." Jake's face darkened. "It's not that simple." Emily's eyes darted to the exit. If she ran now, could she make it? But Jake saw the calculation in her gaze. "I can't let you leave with that," he said, voice low. For a second, Emily saw something flicker in his expression. Regret, hesitation, something that told her part of him didn't want to be doing this. But before she could say anything, the door slammed shut. The lock clicked. Emily's stomach dropped. Someone else was here. Jake turned, his shoulders stiffening, his own surprise evident. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as footsteps echoed toward them. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You should have stayed out of this, Emily." She knew that voice, and it meant she was trapped. If you enjoyed this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling content. Hit that like button if you were on the edge of your seat, and share this video with your friends so they can experience the suspense too. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think will happen next. Your support keeps these stories coming, so make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update.